The audit report listed me as the approving authority for a $45,000 vendor payment that violated our conflict of interest policy. My email to the CFO from 3 weeks earlier explicitly objected to that same payment. The vendor was owned by my manager's brother-in-law. I'd discovered that relationship during routine invoice verification in February. I'd documented the conflict and sent a formal objection to both my manager and the CFO on February 18th. The payment was processed on March 2nd. The audit report was dated March 15th. It stated that I had approved the payment despite the obvious conflict of interest. My electronic signature was on the approval workflow. I'd never signed that approval. The CFO's response to my February 18th email was in my archive. Thank you for flagging this. We'll review before any payment is processed. The payment had been processed anyway, with my name attached to it. My name is Lauren. I worked as a financial analyst at a tech startup in Miami. I reviewed vendor invoices. I verified compliance with company policies. I flagged irregularities before payments went through. I've been doing this for 2 years without issues. Then we hired a new finance director who brought in vendors without proper vetting. The $45,000 payment was the third questionable invoice I'd flagged in as many months. This time, someone had overridden my objection and forged my approval. I opened my email archive and started printing everything. I had 3 key documents: my February 18th email objecting to the payment, the CFO's acknowledgement, the audit report claiming I'd approved it anyway. I printed all 3 and placed them in a folder. Then I reviewed the approval workflow system. Every payment over $10,000 required electronic authorization from the finance analyst and the finance director. I checked my approval history for the past 6 months. 23 payments. All legitimate, all properly documented. The $45,000 payment to my manager's brother-in-law's company was not in my approval history. Someone had added my authorization to the workflow without my knowledge. I took screenshots of my approval history showing the payment was absent. I saved them to my personal cloud storage. Then I waited. The audit meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. All finance department staff. Conference room on the 3rd floor. I arrived 5 minutes early with my folder. My manager was already there. So was the CFO and the external auditor who'd prepared the report. The auditor led the meeting. We've identified several compliance issues during our quarterly review, she said. The most significant involves a conflict of interest violation on a vendor payment processed in early March. She pulled up a slide showing the payment details. This $45,000 payment went to a vendor owned by a family member of company leadership. The payment was approved by the finance analyst despite the clear policy violation. She looked directly at me. Lauren, can you explain why you authorized this payment? I opened my folder. I didn't authorize it, I said. I objected to it in writing on February 18th. I slid my printed email across the table. The auditor read it, then passed it to the CFO. This email clearly states your objection, the auditor said, but the approval workflow shows your electronic signature on March 2nd. I never signed that approval. I've never signed any approval for that vendor. My manager spoke for the first time. The system shows your authorization, he said. Are you saying the system is wrong? I'm saying I didn't approve it. The payment isn't in my approval history. I pulled out my screenshots showing my complete approval record for the past 6 months. These are all the payments I've authorized. The $45,000 payment doesn't appear in my history. The auditor examined the screenshots. This is a discrepancy we need to investigate, she said. The workflow shows approval, but the user history doesn't reflect it. The CFO leaned forward. Can someone access the approval system using another person's credentials? He asked. Only if they have that person's login information, the auditor said. I've never shared my login with anyone, I said. My manager shifted in his seat. Perhaps there was a system error, he said. We should focus on preventing future issues rather than assigning blame. The CFO looked at him. We need to understand how this happened, he said. If there's a system vulnerability, or if credentials were compromised, that's a serious problem. The meeting ended with an action item to conduct a technical review of the approval system. I returned to my desk and continued working. I didn't hear anything for 3 days. On day 4, the IT director sent an email requesting access to my workstation for a security audit. They wanted to review login activity and system access logs. I granted access immediately. The IT audit took 2 days. I worked from a temporary laptop while they examined my primary workstation. On day 6, I received an email from the CFO requesting a private meeting. I arrived at his office at the scheduled time. He closed the door. IT completed their review, he said. Your workstation shows no unusual login activity. Your credentials were not used to approve the payment on March 2nd from your device. I nodded. However, your credentials were used from a different workstation, one assigned to the finance director. I didn't respond. IT found evidence that your username and password were entered on his computer at 4:37 p.m. on March 2nd. The approval was processed at 4:41 p.m. I was in a client meeting from 4 to 5:30 that day, I said. I have the calendar invitation and meeting notes. I've seen those. The timeline confirms you couldn't have been at that workstation. He paused. The external auditor is recommending a formal investigation. The board will be notified. This is no longer just a compliance issue. The meeting ended. I went back to my desk and updated my documentation file with notes from the conversation. 1 week later, my manager was placed on administrative leave. The announcement came via email from HR. No details, no timeline, just a brief statement that the finance director was on leave and his responsibilities would be temporarily reassigned. I was asked to take over invoice processing and vendor management during the interim period. I accepted the additional responsibilities without comment. Over the next 3 weeks, I reviewed every vendor contract my manager had approved in the past year. I found 2 additional payments to companies with undisclosed family connections. Neither had gone through proper conflict of interest review. I documented both and submitted a report to the CFO. He forwarded it to the board's audit committee. 4 weeks after the original audit meeting, the board announced they were conducting a comprehensive review of finance department practices. An external firm would examine all vendor relationships and payment approvals for the past 2 years. My manager's administrative leave was extended indefinitely. I continued managing the department's daily operations: invoice review, payment processing, vendor onboarding. Every transaction was documented. Every approval was logged. Every workflow step was verified. The comprehensive audit took 6 weeks. Auditors interviewed every member of the finance team. They reviewed thousands of transactions. They requested documentation for every vendor relationship established in the previous 2 years. I provided everything they requested: email records, approval histories, objection memos, calendar invites proving my whereabouts during disputed transactions. 8 weeks after my manager's leave began, the board issued their findings. 3 vendor payments totaling $127,000 had been processed with forged approvals. All 3 vendors had undisclosed relationships with company leadership. My credentials had been used to authorize payments I'd explicitly objected to. The finance director was terminated for cause. The decision was announced in a brief company-wide email. I was promoted to interim finance director the same day. The role came with a 35% salary increase and direct reporting to the CFO. I was responsible for rebuilding the department's processes and implementing new controls. My first action was requiring 2-factor authentication for all payment approvals. No single person could authorize payments without a secondary verification step. My second action was implementing mandatory conflict of interest disclosures for all vendor relationships. Any family or personal connection had to be documented before a contract could be signed. The new systems were in place within 3 weeks. The board approved both measures unanimously. 3 months after my promotion, the interim title was made permanent. I was officially the finance director. The CFO presented the decision during a department meeting. Lauren's documentation and procedural rigor prevented significant additional exposure, he said. The board has full confidence in her leadership. I thanked him and moved on to the agenda for the week. I didn't mention the forged approvals. I didn't reference my former manager. I just outlined the payment reviews scheduled for the next quarter. 6 months into my new role, we passed an external audit with 0 compliance findings. The auditors noted that our approval controls exceeded industry standards. The CFO shared the results with the board. I was copied on the email. I filed it with my other documentation and continued working. A year after the original audit, I hired 2 additional analysts to support the growing transaction volume. Both went through comprehensive onboarding on our approval processes and conflict of interest protocols. I trained them personally. I showed them how to verify vendor relationships, how to document objections, how to escalate concerns through proper channels. I didn't tell them why these processes mattered. I just explained what needed to be done and how to do it correctly. The department ran smoothly. Payments were processed on time. Vendors were properly vetted. Conflicts were disclosed and managing according to policy. 18 months after my promotion, I was recruited by a larger tech company. The CFO role, reporting to the CEO, overseeing finance for a company 3 times our size. The notes was comprehensive. Salary, equity, leadership responsibilities that went far beyond my current scope. I accepted.
My departure was announced 2 weeks before my start date at the new company. The board held a small reception. The CEO thanked me for rebuilding the finance department's integrity. I thanked everyone for the opportunity and moved on. The new company had its own challenges: legacy systems, inconsistent controls, vendor relationships that needed review. I implemented the same processes I'd built at my previous role: 2-factor authentication for approvals, mandatory conflict disclosures, clear escalation procedures for compliance concerns. The systems worked the same way in the new environment. 2 years after the forged approval incident, I was managing a finance organisation of 45 people across 3 office locations. We processed millions in vendor payments every quarter. Every transaction was documented, every approval was verified, every relationship was disclosed. Not because I expected fraud, because proper controls prevented the conditions where fraud could occur. 3 years after leaving my original company, I was invited to speak at a finance leadership conference. The topic was building compliance controls in high-growth environments. I presented on approval workflows, conflict of interest management, and documentation protocols. I didn't mention the forged approvals. I didn't reference my former manager or the audit that had revealed the scheme. I just explained the systems that prevented unauthorized transactions and ensured proper oversight. The presentation was well received. Several attendees asked for copies of our policy templates. I provided them. 4 years after the incident, I was promoted to Chief Financial Officer at my current company. I oversaw all financial operations. I reported directly to the board. The first major initiative I launched was a comprehensive audit of all vendor relationships. We reviewed every contract. We verified every ownership structure. We disclosed every potential conflict. The audit took 4 months. We identified and addressed 12 relationships that needed additional disclosure or restructuring. Not because they were fraudulent, because transparency was the foundation of proper governance. The files from the original incident were still in my personal archive. The February 18th email, the CFO's response, the audit report with the forged approval. I hadn't opened them in years, but I remembered exactly what they'd taught me about the difference between being blamed for something and having documentation proving otherwise. The approval I'd never authorized had been attached to my name. The objection I'd documented in writing had protected me when the truth was investigated. Everything after that was just process working the way it should. Slowly, but eventually.